If you want to understand how brutal cold really is, don't start with modern gear reviews or lab-tested insulation charts. Start with young soldiers in Europe and Asia during World War II, issued thin wool uniforms, sleeping on frozen ground, often without tents, heaters, or proper bedding. These men learned quickly that cold was not just discomfort. It was an enemy that killed quietly. Frostbite, trench foot, pneumonia and exhaustion claimed more soldiers than bullets in some campaigns. Out of that pressure came practical field knowledge, and one cold weather technique stands out as shockingly effective even today. It didn't rely on sleeping bags, high-tech fabrics, or modern insulation. It relied on understanding heat, moisture, and the ground itself. Before we get technical, here's the hook most people miss. Soldiers who froze at night weren't freezing because the air was cold. They froze because the ground was stealing their heat, and their own sweat was betraying them. Once you grasp that, everything about cold weather survival changes. Why WWII soldiers feared the ground more than the air. Veterans repeatedly wrote that the frozen earth was worse than wind or snow. Heat loss through conduction drains the body faster than cold air ever could. When a soldier lay directly on frozen soil, heat moved straight out of his core into the ground. Even a thick coat did little to stop this. WWII training manuals emphasized one thing over and over: get off the ground at all costs. This is where the trick begins. Now, let's talk about the layered ground barrier method that soldiers actually used. You see, instead of focusing solely on what wrapped around their bodies, experienced soldiers put their attention on what went under them. They built insulation platforms using whatever they had at their disposal. Pine boughs, straw, dry leaves, reeds, spare uniforms, canvas, and even wooden ammunition crates were flattened into a base. Quite resourceful, wouldn't you say? The goal was simple: trap air between the body and the ground. Air, not fabric, is the true insulator. A man sleeping on 6 inches of pine branches stayed warmer than a man in a thick coat on bare earth. To apply this today, the steps are straightforward. First, clear snow down to solid ground, so melting doesn't soak your insulation. Next, lay a thick layer of dry organic material. If you're in a forest, evergreen branches are ideal because they repel moisture and spring back under weight. Then place a ground cloth poncho or tarp on top. Only after that does body insulation matter. This single change can raise sleeping warmth dramatically, even without a sleeping bag. Why soldiers avoided sweating before sleep. Another counterintuitive lesson from World War II was managing heat before rest. Soldiers were taught to cool down slightly before bedding down. Sweat, a soldier's hidden foe. You see, when sweat became trapped in wool or cotton, it froze once the activity ceased, and this, in turn, pulled precious heat from the body. Quite the perilous situation, really. Now, the manuals were quite clear on this matter. They advised loosening clothing, venting heat, and drying socks before sleep whenever possible. These simple actions could make all the difference in the world, you know. Here's an interesting point. A soldier who went to bed slightly cool but dry survived the night better than one who crawled in warm and damp. It's a subtle but crucial distinction indeed. Modern application is simple but, you know, often ignored. Stop moving before sleep, let sweat evaporate, change into dry base layers if possible, and never overdress while building camp. The goal is dryness, not warmth, at the moment you lie down. The buddy heat technique and controlled body positioning. In extreme conditions, soldiers slept close, sometimes touching shoulders or feet. This was not about comfort. It was heat conservation. Shared body warmth, reduced exposed surface area and slowed heat loss. Units learned to position bodies so major arteries stayed warmer longer. Even solo soldiers curled slightly, with knees bent and arms tucked in, you know, just to minimize any exposed extremities. For modern use, this translates to controlled positioning. Curling up reduces heat loss, and tucking your hands between your thighs or under your armpits really helps preserve circulation. These are small details, but honestly, they add up over hours. You know, wind discipline really made the trick work. But honestly, none of this mattered if the wind just stripped heat away. Back in WWII, soldiers became absolutely obsessive about windbreaks. They slept behind embankments, vehicles, hedgerows, or even shallow foxholes roofed with ponchos. Blocking the wind increased perceived warmth dramatically. Even a simple canvas barrier could, well, raise survivability overnight. Today, even a low wall of snow, logs or a tarp angled into the wind can, you know, double the effectiveness of ground insulation. Wind is a multiplier of cold. Stop it first. Why this method still beats many modern sleeping bags. A sleeping bag without ground insulation compresses beneath body weight, losing most of its insulating value. WWII. Soldiers didn't have luxury bags, but they understood physics. Insulation under you matters more than insulation over you. You know, it's surprising, but many modern campers still get this wrong. They tend to rely on these expensive sleeping bags, but often neglect pads, proper layering and, well, moisture control. The soldier method actually works because it tackles all three heat loss mechanisms at the same time: conduction, convection, and evaporation. What history teaches us about survival discipline? Well, it's not just theory. This knowledge was paid for in frozen fingers and lost toes. Units that learned these lessons had lower cold weather casualties. You see, the method required discipline, not equipment. That's why it remains relevant. Whether you're studying history, preparing for emergencies, or spending nights outdoors, this knowledge is transferable and proven. If you value history that actually teaches something useful, not just dates and battles, this is the kind of knowledge worth preserving. Cold doesn't care what century you're in. The rules haven't changed. If this deep dive added something new to your understanding of wartime survival, subscribe to Iron Age Instincts, share this with fellow historians and survival-minded thinkers, and keep these lessons alive. History only matters if we learn from it.